For us as Christians today, let's be under no illusion. What we believe is rooted in good sound evidence. We don't just have a faith which is a crutch made up to support us. We have faith in trustworthy evidence. And as we begin to look at who the person of Jesus is, be under no illusions. We are reading the documents that were written and have been translated into English from the original language, but were written accurately and translated accurately from what people who were with Jesus wanted us to know. The great thing is we have a Bible that is trustworthy, and that Bible points us towards the person of Jesus. And as we begin to explore who he is, let's be confident that what we believe is true. So what we've seen so far is that there is evidence outside of the Bible for the existence of someone called Jesus Christ. And we have an accurate record written by people who were with him at the time of their experiences of who he is. We can have confidence as Christians that our faith is not a myth, it's not a legend, but it's based on some good sound evidence. I want us to look at some of the church history to help us sort of unpack this a bit further, and again to lay some foundations for our studies into who Jesus is. One of the debates of the early church for the first few centuries was over this very question of who Jesus is. And I wonder, do you sometimes feel a little bit like Peter, where Jesus, do you remember, turned around to Peter and said, "Who do you say I am?" That was a question that consumed the minds of the early church for centuries. Remember that after Jesus died and went back to heaven, the church came under massive persecution and was scattered, but grew dramatically, thousands of people coming to faith in very short periods of time. And as the apostles went out, as the church went out, the church grew rapidly. And at the centre of this was the teaching about who Jesus was. But human nature is human nature, and as you move away from the source, you need to come back to accuracy, which is why people began to write letters and the apostles began to write down a record so that people had something to work from in order to have a consistency of belief. Those letters were shared. When we read letters like Galatians and Ephesians, those were letters written by Paul to a group of churches that people would know what they believe. And the same is true for us today. But through the first centuries, there was a development in trying to understand and interpret what was being written by the people who were with Jesus. The Old Testament is largely non-contested because we share the Old Testament scriptures with the Jews. So the Old Testament has a good sound basis for belief. The Old Testament was looking ahead, wanting to see a Messiah come and a Saviour. And when Jesus came and performed the miracles and was crucified, died, rose again and went back to heaven, the question that consumed the early church was this the promised Messiah? That was a debate for the first few centuries, and we might have it made famous today by things like Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code. And remember that was a work of fiction. But Dan Brown takes some of the writings and researches things from the early church and presents them in a very, very fun and interesting film and in an interesting book. But a lot of what he said, it sort of deviates a little bit from the truth of what was happening at that time. For the first 3 centuries, the church was a persecuted church, and the New Testament was being written to a group of believers who were being scattered under persecution, dispersed believers having a developing experience of who Jesus was. And as the church scattered, the church began to form new centres where the leaders of the church began to form. Some of those were in Rome, very much a European Western church. Some of those were in Constantinople, which began to develop an Asian, sort of Eastern Orthodox church. And some of those were in Alexandria, in Egypt, which began to develop an African church. These 3 main centres of belief began to take the writings that they were reading, the letters that were going around, and began to try to sort of theologically understand and interpret who Jesus was from those documents.